So the guy went around looking at research agencies, universities. How can I preserve potatoes? So, well, he got the answer. It's quite easy. Dehydrate the potato and it retains its properties once you put it back in water. So the guy went around buying as cheaply as possible, as much potato as he could, filling warehouses, and then chopping them into slices and packaging them, leaving them in big sacks.
Professor Pat Utomi, can you unmute, please? Because we'd like to hear from you. Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, German. It's wonderful. It's a good thing that you jumped on Uber. I thought you would have jumped on Okada. That's what people like us tend to do.
I was afraid.
The history of Okada in this country has not been properly written. Once upon a time, Chief Emeka Abiola and Chief Segun Oshoba were on Okadas cruising down Echo Bridge, rushing to their meeting. And I chose to imitate them many times. And one day on my way to the airport, when I got off the car and got on some Okada on Mobolaji Bank Anthony Way, as it is now called, about 30 Okada riders started to follow us to give protection. I was embarrassed. But
to us.
Yeah. Well, you know, the pandemic brought many challenges to the structure of the global economy. But what we often forget is that it brought a lot of opportunities also. Opportunity and problems always tend to go together. And one of my favorite stories about challenges and opportunity go back to the Great Depression, and people were jumping off 50-story buildings to their death because their entire wealth had been wiped out. In fact, there's a great story about a meeting in Chicago in 1925 or 6, brought together some of the wealthiest men in the world. And by 1932, a couple of them had committed suicide. One or two of them had gone bananas completely, mental asylum. And one or two had lost most of their wealth, and so on and so forth. So it was a terrible period. And I recall the story of a gentleman who, as he watched people jump to their deaths, said to himself, what's the opportunity in this whole thing? And the one opportunity that will always occur is that when things go bad, people turn to what economists would generally call inferior goods. I recall arriving in Thailand, just by way of irony. I was just told today I was being offered an invitation to come to Thailand for something in November. And it reminded me of my last visit to Thailand, which was quite a long time ago. I've stopped at the Bangkok airport without getting off on my way to Vietnam and a few places there. But the last time I was in Bangkok was during the Asian financial crisis in 1998, 97, 98. And they had a market there that they call market for people who used to be millionaires. That's where they went to get rid of their Rolls Royces and their yachts and stuff like that. The particular gentleman I was talking about, who was thinking of what opportunity the Great Depression provided him, kind of like said, which inferior good will people be turning to? I mean, those who used to eat filet mignon recognized that to eat filet mignon was now impractical. They couldn't afford it for sure. Would be turning to something else. So he asked himself, what is the most inferior food? Now, back in those days, the potato was a joke. You know, it literally grew in the wild in Idaho. And so this man thought, how can I possibly make people like this food that was left only for the poorest of the poor who were too ashamed to eat it in public, so they will hide to eat it. But my first problem is, how do I even preserve it? And so the guy went around looking at research agencies, universities. How can I preserve potatoes? So, well, he got the answer is quite easy. Dehydrate the potato and it retains its properties once you put it back in water. So the guy went around buying as cheaply as possible, as much potato as he could, filling warehouses, and then chopping them into slices and packaging them, leaving them in big sacks. And all you needed to do, take out the thing, put it in water, and it's back with all the properties of potato, and you can fry it. And to elevate the stature of this very lowly food, he decided that what he had just chopped up was not potato, it was French fries. Kind of sounded nice and good. And people began to quietly eat this new thing called French fries. And then he had the good fortune of running into a guy called Ray Kroc, who founded McDonald's. And so between the French fry and the hamburger, the American ultimate staple was born. And this man called R.J. Simplot died a billionaire from showing the world how to eat an inferior food. So in many ways, the supply chain disruptions of COVID-19 present a lot of opportunities, and particularly for me, who is interested in Pan-African business ventures, integration in Africa. As you know, I serve as chairman of PAFTRAC, the Pan-African Trade and Investments Committee, Private Sector Trade and Investments Committee. And I all the time ask myself, how do we increase intra-African trade? Because if you look at the other regions of the world, the Asians, the trade amongst Asian countries come to a very healthy percentage. In Africa, it's literally non-existent. And when the supply chain crisis hit last year, we found that depending on China for everything obviously had its dangers. And so for me, this is an opportunity in the face of AFTA to explore how we can aggregate across borders in Africa and be able to internally within the continent trade in a way that would help us overcome supply chain disruptions in the future. Right now, we have a situation in Nigeria, for example, where the ports are still a complete mess. After the disruptions and attempts to resume, we had these bottlenecks, and our usual problems with managing the maritime sector came on to compound things. But right now, it is clear that China, as a spoke in global value chains, or global supply chains, is creating problems for everybody. And so a big lesson for us is how can we make Africa one of two things. The new factory of the world, there's actually a book on that, which is inspired by the Chinese, Africa, the world's next factory. If Africa is going to be world's next factory, how do we manage the supply chain crisis that can come from our experience from this pandemic? And that is something I expect entrepreneurs, thought leaders, and development finance organizations on the continent to be averting their minds significantly. Second issue that I think the challenges of COVID provide opportunity for economic reflection on is the point about aggregating in Africa. I was just speaking to an MBA class at the Lagos Business School about less than an hour ago. And I was saying to them, look, when you buy a Versace, you generally think of this company that has set up factories making shoes, making suits, making this, making that. In reality, Versace does pretty little other than building a brand. And then it determines certain qualities, that standards that it wants its product to be. Maybe it gets the design and all of that, and then goes to smallholder Italian families and anywhere else in the world, sometimes even in China, Korea, whatever. And they make quality suits to those specifications for maybe $30 and put the stamp Versace on it and sell it for £3,000 on the high streets in London. I recall I on vacation and somebody suggested I would go to some of the outlets, factories, because Mauritius was one of the African countries that did best in taking advantage of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act in the United States. A couple of Indian garment companies and a number from elsewhere located in Mauritius to take advantage of AGOA to export into the United States. We as a country, Nigeria, for example, failed disastrously to get any benefit out of AGOA. But I remember very much the case of a certain Indian manufacturer of garments that moved into a solo estate and had so much trouble. It was going from government office to government office, this permit, that trouble, that trouble. One day he just created his equipment and moved it to Kenya. I moved them to Kenya. And the last time I checked, he was supplying a couple of thousand blue jeans every day to Walmart. So if we can draw lessons from experience, because what I learned on that trip, on that vacation in Mauritius, was there were these outlets, they were making designer clothes in Mauritius. And we went to one of them, whatever. Yeah, fancy suits, and $200 for a suit. And you know, I thought, okay, these are very nice suits. Until I walked into a store in London, and that suit was selling for I don't know how many £1,000. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know. So we need big trading companies to emerge from our continent, the Marubeni types, that would aggregate across the continent products of that nature and can supply 100,000 pieces to Walmart every Monday morning at 8 a.m. sharp. Because those are the kind of agreements and standards that those kinds of big groups are used to. As we are structured today, many of us cannot play in those kinds of markets. But if we get big trading companies who then organize these things, and there's nothing wrong with our inviting some of our South Korean or Asian counterparts to become co-investors in a couple of large African trading companies. And their experience, global experience, will facilitate how we organize. And we can expand trade significantly in the continent as a result of this. So this, for me, happens to be one of the great advantages of the pandemic, because it forces new thinking. And this new thinking, if managed well, can lead to economic expansion and serious growth. But at the other level, it reminds us of part of the failings of our continent around taking care of itself. Vaccines, look at how we are going cap in hand, begging everybody. Oh, even the president of South Africa had to make a speech about, oh, how you people don't want to give us this thing. I mean, like, you know, and somebody reminds me, in fact, it was Philip Asiodu, who said to me, look, you know that the yellow fever vaccine was actually invented in Yaba in Nigeria in 1927. And I thought, ooh, excuse me, I had even forgotten that. So we need to organize along those lines. I actually have been pursuing, maybe I can say this publicly for the first time, a group of researchers in the US who have been doing tests in Nigeria, in Kigali, Rwanda, and in South Africa and Haiti on malaria vaccines. And I can say that they've reached close to 90% efficacy on a vaccine for malaria. And part of what I'm trying to organize is a network for distributing those across the continent. If we leak malaria, what it would do for productivity on our continent will be incredible. Because as you all know, one of my favorite arguments in economics is the joke, well, not joke, serious matter. The two competing perspectives on why Africa experiences slow economic growth. And one perspective says it's because of geography and destiny. And that perspective, often championed by Jeff Sachs, suggests that Africa is poor because of malaria, because it's located in the tropics. Because it's located in the tropics and people suffer from malaria, productivity is very low. Again, people forget that Obi Ezekwesili used to work in Jeff Sachs Center at the Kennedy School in Harvard, and that Obi returned to Nigeria essentially as ambassador to facilitate conversation around that subject. And indeed, President Obasanjo's first major policy rollout was called Roll Back Malaria, in response to Sachs' view that if the world can get together and help Africa solve malaria, Africa's economic growth will take off. Of course, the opposite argument, generally led by Oxford's Paul Collier, is that is all crap, and that the problem of Africa is the policy choices that Africa's leaders have been making. I generally support the Collier argument, but there's no question that if we take care of malaria, we will make a significant dent in Africa's economic growth possibilities. And I'm therefore very excited about this engagement that I have with this initiative to bring this malaria vaccine. And I think all of these have been facilitated by seeing opportunity in the crisis of the pandemic. So I will close before I'm beating on my head, German, by saying that my perspective I want to focus on is on what opportunities for restructuring African economies and integrating them does the COVID-19 pandemic provide us, rather than worrying myself about the challenges of overcoming supply chain crises that have been triggered by the pandemic and the problems of crude oil prices that dropped during it, and so on and so forth, because there are many. But if we look at the opportunities, we'll travel much further. Thank you.
Professor Utomi and Dr. Muda Yusuf, what they think would be 1 to 2 trade lessons we learned, or maybe Africa would have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, talking about the business sector. And then how would they rate African governments in terms of managing the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps starting with Nigeria and the rest of Africa?
Well, thank you very much. You know, part of the challenge, again, that's why those who look at our politics and worry about the kind of quality of people who go into public life affects outcomes that we have. The key is competitiveness of our economy. But it does seem to me that somehow the nature of our politics and political class is that they don't seem to understand the role of the political actor in creating a competitive environment for the country. I mean, let's take the reaction generally to the pandemic at broad people level and at corporate level. We saw a situation where in Europe and North America, they were so concerned to keep businesses alive that they poured out grants. I mean, Germans were literally pouring money into businesses. Shock. I mean, a lot of the challenges that the lockdowns and all of those will create for the businesses. In our situation here, I don't think we saw any such major push of cash, literally speaking, into businesses as we saw in Europe and North America, because it was time for the ultimate Keynesian kind of intervention. Yes, we don't have too much cash, but that's even if there's any time that you can justify printing money to pump into the system, it was that kind of situation. And we didn't do it at the time. Even at the level of the people and the so-called palliatives. I mean, we all saw what happened when even what the private sector donated was kept locked up. So that unfortunately, the pandemic deepened the distrust between the people and government. People felt that political actors just used the pandemic to line their pockets and couldn't even think of their humanity in a time when people were suffering so much. So that did not help matters. But the bottom line is that what we are faced with is the competitiveness of our economy. What would make us more competitive, and how could we have facilitated the possibilities of what needed to be done on the part of some actors? Well, to be fair, I think that in spite of Muda's comments, that the NCDC fellows were quite made quite a decent effort, but the situation could have been managed much better or integrated into economic strategies. Okay, yeah, that was it. I wasn't able to. I finally got it out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I was saying that there was a kind of paralysis on the part of government. There was an inability to understand the consequences of the pandemic for, keeping the economy functional. And so incentives did not come appropriately. People were struggling. And when they were offered from this central bank I don't know what to call it, like yes, which is a problem of its own. There was the tendency for the central bank to take over the governing of the country.
I think we're having the challenge with Professor Utomi's sound. I want to get back to Professor Utomi, but we couldn't hear the last round of his contribution then. So, Prof, okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's more or less the same points that have just been made now. I was saying that the big challenge with how the pandemic was managed was that government was not as responsive as other governments around the world, in many ways, businesses were gasping for breath, and incentives were coming from every which way because those governments realized that business was the life wire, that if business continued to thrive, they would then have people to tax. But we have this strange situation where we did not show enough care, in my opinion, for sustaining these businesses. Partly because there is a sense in Nigeria that it's about oil. Once oil can be produced and the government can get oil receipts, it can do whatever it wants to do. So it doesn't really care to nurture business to produce the lady goose that can then be taxed to run government properly. And this is a very sad thing for Nigeria if we consider that one of the things that the pandemic should have brought to us as a lesson is how quickly oil prices can collapse because those who use crude oil suddenly can't function. And we are now being given all this notice about energy transition. In the next 15 to 20 years, oil isn't going to be a critical factor for most of those who buy it today. And yet, we did not take advantage of the pandemic to begin to grow other businesses, to begin to commit citizens to be more productive. I mean, look at the point that's just been made about citizens' receipts in America. In places like Canada, people were being paid, so much money just to, ensure that they came out from the pandemic in good shape. So we really need to rethink the leadership approach that we have in our country and the mindset and the kinds of people actually who go into leadership positions who are completely disconnected from society. And this is very, very, very challenging for us as a country. If we're going to build a society that can survive the post-oil era. Okay. So that's really the end of my contribution.
Okay.